So today we're making some sand dunes, or sandy hills, or whatever you want to call them. Luckily, it's not that difficult to make. So let's get straight into it by starting with adding a plane. We're going to want to increase the size of the plane quite a bit. And then in the modifiers tab, we're going to add a subdivision surface modifier. We're going to keep the type on being simple because we just want to generate a little bit more geometry. We don't want to change any shapes or anything. And we're going to set the level to anywhere between like 6 and 10. Let's start at the lower side because any more geometry than we need is just going to lag out the PC. And then we'll also add in a displacement modifier, which will just change the height of where our plane is located. It's just a little weird, right? The way we get what we want is by making a new texture here, which will put it down, still not what I want, but then going down here into the texture properties, setting the type from image or movie to being clouds. Now we're getting somewhere. So let's set this to shade smooth. It's a little bit jagged, so we're going to go levels viewport to 7 instead of 6. That's a bit better. But this doesn't really look like a desert. If anything, this looks like a very jagged mountainy area. So going back into the texture properties, we can increase the size so that the hills are a little bit more spread out. Maybe we want to have it a little bit more like this. And then if we increase the depth as well, because at this point it's only the larger hills, and if we decrease it, that'll be even more apparent. But then when we start increasing it, it will start adding in more finer detail. So if we increase it a lot, you can see there's a lot of very small fine detail, as much as the geometry allows, of course. So I think we should stick with 3, or let's go with 4. I think that's quite good in this case. But these hills still might be a little bit too high, right? Well, luckily in the displacement modifier itself, we can just lower the strength a little bit. And actually, we probably want to set this to 8, just to have it a little bit more smoothed out. We can also set this to shade smooth. And this is a pretty decent start. So now we're going to go into the texture for all of the actual like smaller details. Because all of these extra like small details we're adding to the hills themselves, they don't really account for the individual grains of sand, do they? So making a new material here, you could very well just set it to being slightly yellowish and call it a day. You probably want to increase the roughness to maximum as well, because sand is a very diffusing material. It's a lot of very small individual rocks, so any light that hits it, it's going to disperse and scatter quite a bit. And as a result of that, it's going to be a very non-reflective, very diffuse type of stuff, because its surface area, relatively speaking, as a whole, is absolutely massive. And if you're making a more cartoonish-like style, this is probably good enough. But we're going to go for something slightly more realistic. First things first, coming up here into Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, you're going to want to make sure that the Node Wrangler add-on is turned on. If it is, you're going to add a new noise texture, and you're going to hold Ctrl and Shift and click the noise texture. The Node Wrangler add-on allows you to preview individual nodes like that, which is very, very useful. And the noise is way too spread out. So if we increase the scale of it, you will see the noise itself is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. You actually want it to be relatively very small, so something like this might still be too big actually. And then we're going to set the roughness to being much higher as well, because you can see when we zoom in here, if we set the roughness all the way to nothing, it gets very pixelated and just almost low resolution. When we set the roughness very high, you can see a lot of fine detail coming back in, and that's really what we do want. So now we can mess around with the detail, which does something very similar. Don't go overboard with the detail itself though. And like this is starting to look like a black and white image of what the desert should look like. So now let's add a little bit of color to that, which we can do by adding a color ramp node and hooking that up like this. Vector into the vector, and then the color into the base color here. In the color ramp node, we're going to change the black color to being a dark brownish yellow, and then the white color is going to be slightly less bright first and foremost, and very slightly towards yellow as well. Don't overdo it, because as you can see, this looks just very bad and very weird. Sand is actually not as yellow as you might think it is. I mean, this might already be too much. It's also a little bit too green, admittedly. So let's go RGB, decrease the green a little, and this seems to be about right. So now we have a bit more texture to our sand, which is a great improvement, but it's still rather flat. So the next thing you do is you add a bump node, and you add in the factor from your noise pattern into the height of the bump node, and then the normal will go into the normal of your shader, and suddenly that makes a huge difference. Normals are so important for generating detail, it's kind of absurd. And now if we go into the rendering mode and we put in like a, let's do a sunlight here, you can start to see things looking actually pretty good for like a desert. This is everything you'd want. And if we then set this to being cycles, it will look even better, obviously, because now it's being path traced. And you could leave it here. If you're just doing this for a render or anything within Blender itself, this is really, it's good enough. But we're going to optimize things one step more, because at this point, if we go up here real quick and we set the statistics, this is 66,000 vertices, which isn't bad, but it could be better. And if it could be better, it probably should be better. So going back into the modifier stack here, we can add a Decimate Modifier, keep it on collapse, and just start decreasing this and see when the actual shape of our sand starts to change significantly. Because you can see we're down to about 0.2, and the shape of our sand has not significantly changed and the quality decreased. But our vertice count is down to 13,000. Going all the way down to this is a little too much. You can see things are getting a tiny bit too jagged, depending on if it's something close by, far away. If you're going to be like, if it's going to be the world you're walking in within a video game, you probably want it to be a little bit more detailed. So let's stick with something like this, which ends up being about 6,500 vertices for something that still looks about the same. And just like that, we have a sand dune desert. It's really as easy as that. So if you've enjoyed this video and you found it helpful, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more tutorials about Blender and game development assets and all that kind of stuff in the future. If you've got any questions as to how to make a certain thing, do feel free to leave it in the comments down below and I'll get to it as soon as I can. If you want to know how to then bake this texture into an image file to use in something like Unreal or Unity, I do have a separate video all on the topic of baking textures for use in game engines and other software, so do go check that out in the link down below in the description or up top in the cards.